Hello and welcome to Unlearning Unconscious Biases in the Workplace with Dr. Samantha Rae-Dickenson, hosted by Virtual Patent Gateway. Virtual Patent Gateway founder Ashley Chung has a passion for supporting women in the workplace and is committed to developing a growth mindset within VPG. Today's discussion will be moderated by Jessica Marks, Senior Patent Counsel at Unified Patents LLC. Ms. Marks is an experienced patent litigator and was previously an adjunct professor at the George Washington University Law School. This webinar will be recorded for future use, and there will be a short Q&A at the end of the session. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jessica.
Hi, everyone. I'm pleased to be able to interview Dr. Samantha Rae-Dickenson today. Dr. Sam is the CEO and lead DEI strategist at DSRD Consulting. Dr. Sam has served as the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Principal Strategist for a federal agency in her previous position. She managed the Black employee portfolio during the global crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. She has also worked as a senior accreditation specialist to assess compliance and accreditation policies related to cultural competency, diversity and inclusion, and financial planning for public health graduate and undergraduate schools and programs. Now, if anyone in the audience has any questions about this evening's discussion, please write them in a chat to me. You should see a little button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to answer them along the way if they're pertinent to the discussion at that point. But if we don't get to them, I'm going to look and check and try to get to them before we close this session tonight. Well, Dr. Sam, thanks for being here this evening.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk about unconscious biases today.
So am I. Yeah. So let's jump right in. First, a very basic question. What are unconscious biases and why is it important that we learn about them?
Sure. So unconscious biases are social stereotypes about groups of people created on a subconscious level without our awareness. So we all have unconscious biases because our culture, the media, and our upbringing contribute to the development of those biases. So the way our brains work is as we come into contact with different people and in different scenarios and environments, our brains categorizes the information that we're receiving into stereotypes so that we can make decisions quickly as we continue to meet and interact with people. So it's an innate mechanism that helps us to determine if we're in a safe environment or a dangerous environment, and it helps us to make decisions really quickly. So we all have unconscious biases, and it's important that we are aware of those unconscious biases because they influence the way in which we interact with people and the way we show up. Another common way in which unconscious biases presents themselves are through microaggressions. And I know that word has become very familiar and sort of like a buzzword, especially in the DEI space. But unchecked unconscious biases typically stem from a discriminatory root or history. And so that's why it's important that we understand the biases that we all have.
Well, I'm glad you brought up microaggressions because I definitely have some questions about that. But before we quite get into that, I want to talk a little bit more about unconscious biases, particularly in the workplace. So for those interested in a business's bottom line, how can addressing unconscious biases or failing to address them affect the bottom line?
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned that unconscious biases can influence the way we show up and act, thus resulting in microaggression. So it's not the unconscious biases that may affect the bottom line. It's typically the actions that follow those unconscious biases. So microaggressions influence biases in the hiring process, for example, and can result in a lack of diversity through the recruitment and hiring process. That's one way. And we all should have heard or been familiar with by now. There's been a lot of research to show that diverse teams have diversity of thought and are more innovative, which creates an increase in revenue. So if you're not hiring diverse groups of people, that's one way it negatively affects the bottom line. Another way is customers are also more likely to support a company with employees who look like them. So if a company is very monolithic in their representation, then the way in which they align with the constituents that they're trying to serve, unless they're trying to serve a monolithic group of people, you're not going to be as competitive if your team isn't as diverse. Also, when someone experiences microaggressions in the workplace, they become detached from their work, they develop lower self-esteem, and oftentimes depression if the microaggressions are consistent enough or severe enough. So that means that employees become less engaged, they're not committed, and they're not sharing innovative ideas anymore, which feeds into my point earlier about having diverse teams. So lack of inclusion plus experiencing microaggressions causes high turnover, and companies spend more money to recruit and onboard and train new employees. So basically, microaggressions impacts the company's bottom line from many different perspectives, from recruiting and hiring and onboarding through alignment and connection with their constituents and clientele, to high turnover rates and having to spend money to replenish the people that leave.
Yeah, great points. Thanks. So what would be some effective tools to unlearn some of these biases?
Sure. So whenever doing any kind of DEI related work, I always encourage people to first start with educating themselves. In this particular sense, it would be helpful to learn about different groups of people. So people who don't look like you or share the same beliefs or share the same cultural or religious backgrounds, do some digging and try to learn more about different groups of people. This will also help to replace the negative stereotypes we may subconsciously have. And then even if you don't have any subconscious negative stereotypes, you may have some perceptions about groups of people and the way they show up. It may not mean negative, it's just like an assumption. We may not understand how someone with a visible disability, for example, has to navigate day-to-day life. And so we bypass certain things that they need to feel accommodated because that's just not our lived experience. But if we learn more about ADA compliance and different groups within the disability community, then we can know how to interact with and be more conscious of the way we show up and interact with people with visible disabilities. So educating yourself, learning about different groups of people, and then also broaden your friend group and meet with people and interact with people who don't look like you. The more opportunity we have to excuse me, to engage with different groups of people, the more things that we can learn about those groups. So versus having to Google something online and just read from a third party, you can learn it firsthand by interacting with people. And next is practicing individuation. So that means when you meet someone that's from a different background as you try to get to know that person on a personal level and negate the negative stereotypes or assumptions. So if you meet someone for the first time, don't automatically let your brain start to calculate something about that person. Wait until you meet them, get to know them on an individual basis. That also helps to kind of retrain our minds to think about different groups of people as we come into contact with people from different backgrounds.
And so your answer just brought up a question for me. So because I feel like when we consider about how to be inclusive, it's almost trite that we always think about race, gender, sexual orientation, period, kind of. You're mentioning several other groups. So are there other identities that you think are sometimes overlooked or that you'd like to see more employers consider?
Yeah. I would say those with disabilities, both visible and non-visible, and neurodiversity. So which kind of can fall under the category of disabilities. I think a lot of time those groups of people are overlooked, and reasonable accommodations aren't afforded to those with disabilities, because people always write them off as being too inconvenient or too much of a hassle. And I feel like that's just unfair to those groups of people. The policies that are interwoven within our society already are inequitable and don't accommodate those with disabilities effectively enough. So I really believe that employers can step in and use the accommodations needed for these groups as the default, so that it's just a natural way of being and showing up for these employers, so that those with disabilities can automatically feel included. So I would say that group, but there are tons of other groups. It may not be something as overt as like race or socioeconomic status, but considering people who are caregivers for family members or remote workers. I think now with the pandemic, people, being that a lot of people work remotely, that's becoming more top of mind. But before that, there were barely any policies for people who worked remotely. And oftentimes when I would work with companies, a lot of the remote workers would feel excluded. And that would be a very glaring issue that companies had. So I think when approaching things from a lens of an equitable lens, we have to think about those who have the least amount of access to resources and figure out what it is that they need. So kind of stepping outside of ourselves and thinking about people who may not have easy access to things.
Yeah. I mean, just the idea of providing easy access to something helps everyone. Like if it's easier, to be more inclusive, I could see how it would be beneficial for your entire employee base.
Right.
Okay. Well, so is unlearning biases all about trying to first of all, is it all about unlearning negative biases and negative stereotypes, or what are some other tools, or what should be our goal here? Is to change our behaviors, or what do you see?
That's a really good question. So I think it does start with just an awareness of unconscious biases, like what the term itself even means. And typically when I'm doing trainings about unconscious biases, I like to do an exercise to help people show how unconscious biases just show up. And the exercise that I do, I can do it now if everyone's interested. It takes like 5 minutes. So let me know and I can do it.
I say do it. Let's do it.
Okay, so what I ask people to do normally is to close your eyes, and then I'm gonna paint a picture, describe like a setting, and then ask you some questions at the end. So close your eyes, everyone, and imagine that you're in a park, you're sitting on a bench, you're just sitting there, you're taking a break. It's the middle of the day, and you happen to see someone walk by. They're on their phone, so they have AirPods in, and they're holding a cup of coffee from Starbucks. And they also have a briefcase in their other hand, and they have a well-tailored suit on. They're talking on the phone really loudly. They're walking really fast. That's the scenario. And the questions I typically ask at the end are, what is the gender of that person? What is the race of that person? Where is that person going? And what city are you in? So Jess, what gender do you think that person is? What race? What city are you in? And where do you think that person's going?
Yeah, so it's interesting because it changed as you gave me more details what I was thinking of. But I ended up with like a New York City bench, white guy with a briefcase walking fast, doing his business. Yeah.
So, and actually, Ashley said the same thing. To our participants, what did you guys automatically come up with in your head? You could type it in the chat.
Oh, somebody added that he is a lawyer. Yeah, that's our audience.
Right.
Yeah.
So as you can see, Chicago. So major cities, we naturally assume like busy, walking, talking loudly with big cities. And because of the demographics of this group, probably automatically assume lawyers, probably because of the briefcase. We probably associate lawyers with men just naturally. And so that's how unconscious biases work. You see, none of that was negative per se. It was just like how we painted a picture in our mind. But there are some assumptions, especially if you're not familiar with a specific group of people, there are some assumptions that we've formulated just based on what we see on TV that can influence how we show up. So back to your question about what tools someone can use to unlearn unconscious biases. First, it starts with just acknowledging that unconscious biases exist, and then working to consciously determine what unconscious biases you have as an individual. And so I will share me personally. Earlier on, when I was a little bit younger, when I first started working in the DEI space, I didn't really know what ableism was. And I never really had any reason to like understand what people with disabilities go through. And so saying things like, that's crazy or that's insane is ableist language. And I had no idea. Not because I don't like people with disabilities or I'm trying to be discriminatory. That's just not my reality. And I don't really know anyone personally that has a disability. But through my studies and through networking with other people in the DEI space, I learned about ableism, and I learned about how certain phrases stem from negative stigma about people with disabilities. And it's tied to like capitalism and just the negative way in which we view performance. So people who aren't able to perform the way in which companies want them to perform are automatically disposable. People with disabilities fall under that category because they need additional accommodations, and that's additional time and energy and money being spent to accommodate that group. And so there's a negative stereotype associated with that group. I didn't know any of this. So once I learned it, I had to train myself. And sometimes I still say, oh my God, that's crazy, because I've just always said it all my life. But I stop myself now and I retrain myself to think like, you can't say that anymore. So I'll stop myself and repeat what I said and take that phrase out. So that's just an example of the process in which you would start to unlearn unconscious biases. Acknowledge that they exist, confront your own unconscious biases, and then do some research to learn more about the groups of people that you may have had an unconscious bias about.
And one thing I love about the way you're talking about this, Dr. Sam, is I don't know if you're intentionally doing it or in your learning, you just learned it this way, but saying it people with disabilities instead of like the disabled or disabled people, like recognizing them as a person first. So it's those little things that you don't realize maybe are microaggressions, you know.
Yep. I had to learn that. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I didn't grow up saying it that way either, but learned it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, back to my business questions then. So let's say that you're a supervisor and you want to introduce measures to address unconscious biases. How do you convince your employees that this is worth their time?
I think the recommendation is to tie DEI related things, especially behavior specific DEI related concepts, to performance, because it gets people to care. I'm kind of on the fence about that. And I do want to say we can't convince anyone to unlearn their unconscious bias. What we can do is say you cannot commit a microaggression against someone else, because that's then infringing on how you engage with your coworkers, and that affects the culture, and then that affects everyone. So we would have to address the microaggression itself and not the unconscious bias. But as a leader, I would just encourage people to check their unconscious biases, because it impacts the way in which we show up in the workplace, and that impacts the accomplishment of the mission. So I like to be very mission and data or solutions driven. So everyone is committed to their job because they agree, well, it should be, along with money and having getting paid. It should be because you believe in the mission. And so if you can revert back to that and say, you know, we're all here to accomplish the mission, and we're all here to do our job responsibilities. And we need to do that effectively by making sure we can engage with our coworkers in an effective way. And just holding them accountable by issuing some sort of by reprimanding them if they commit a microaggression or some sort of disciplinary action. It depends on the dynamic of the company. So if it's a smaller company or a larger company, how well management even communicates with those that they lead, because I know some companies, it's very hierarchical and bureaucratic. So it all depends on the dynamic of the company, but I suggest to introduce some disciplinary actions and policies or processes in place to mitigate microaggressions. So providing a way in which employees can report when a microaggression happens, and then following that up with checking in with the employee to see what happened, and then solving the issue, whether that be changing team members, or if it's connected to a bonus, they get a percentage of their bonus taken away, something along those lines.
I like it. That's a strong position. I don't often hear people like say like, yes, there should be consequences if it's important.
Absolutely.
So, and I'm sorry, maybe I missed it. What's your feeling on like trainings? And so you talked about how to make sure that the microaggressions are addressed, but how do you work on educating people?
Sure, yes. So I offer tips for those with limited budgets, because a lot of companies do say they don't have the budget for DEI, which I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think it's just not as a priority as companies want it to be, so they don't dedicate the budget. But for starters, there are so many tools online. I know people like to say you can Google it, but you really can. If you go on Google right now and type in common DEI terms and concepts, a PDF will pull up with like 3 pages worth of terms and definitions related to DEI, foundational concepts that everyone should be aware of. And you could just literally start there. Like if your company has like a town hall every month, a portion of the town hall could be dedicated to just simply going over the terms and reviewing what those terms are. And as you build out the budget, you can hire a consultant to do some workshops and trainings. I will say though, trainings alone do not shift culture. It's an important part of shifting the culture, but it's not sufficient enough to just do a workshop or to just do a training. Even if you do it every year or every quarter, it's not enough. You need a DEI strategy, and that's what I specialize in. You have to have a strategy that's tied to the company's mission and that is encompassing of all the departments across the company. If not, you will just be doing a training every year. It's kind of like regular onboarding stuff. You know, when you get your employee handbook, you don't know everything that's in there. You can like reference it when you need important information about like PTO, but that is not how you change culture. That's just like a document with information. So similar, that's how the trainings work. It's like a one-off kind of thing. It just checks the box like, hey, we made our employees aware about unconscious biases. That's done, check. But what are you doing to cultivate that in the culture? You can't do that unless you have a strategy. The strategy has to be tied to the mission.
So I think you might have said a couple of things that are going to address my next question, but I feel like, you know, as a woman, I've had the experience of going into trainings like inclusivity trainings and seeing only other women and minorities there.
Yeah.
So what are some ways that you can make the trainings more inviting to all, or at least make sure everyone shows up and hears what's going on?
Yeah. So I think that the trainings are typically inviting. People just don't resonate with the topics. They feel like it's not applicable to them, or they don't really understand like why do they need to be a part of it. And so I always recommend to make it mandatory. I mean, everyone should be learning about this, because DEI, it's not even just something that you should do at work. Like, this is just how you're supposed to show up in society when you interact with people from different backgrounds, learning how to be inclusive and equitable, and not say things that are harmful to people. So this type of information is critical for everyone to know. So I believe that it should be mandatory. And so when leadership requires that everyone attend, that's a step in the right direction. So even if everyone does attend, not everyone will pay attention. Not everyone will be open-minded enough to receive the information and then internalize it and practice it after that. But it's a step in the right direction to make sure that the topics are being socialized across the company.
Well, before I go to my next question, I just want to say I love what's going on with the chat. We don't have any questions, but I like that people are, being vocal, because I agree this is a topic I love. I'd be in the chat if I wasn't speaking right now. So let's flip the scenario a little bit. What if you're the employee and you want your company to address unconscious biases? What are some ways to convince your boss or your employer to use some of the tools that you've been mentioning here?
Sure. That also depends on the type of company. I'm a data person. I'm a researcher at heart and a strategist. So I love data. And that will always be my approach to present some data to say, here are the numbers. This is actually what's going on in the company. You can't refute it. This is what people are saying. We see these people, we have like a high turnover rate. People are leaving. In the employees engagement survey, we're seeing that people say they don't feel included. So we need to fix this. And talk about the bottom line. I don't like to use the bottom line as a way to convince leadership to buy into DEI, because I feel like, again, this is something that we should be doing just because it's the right thing to do. But some people need a little bit more convincing. So when you talk about the bottom line and show the correlation between a lack of inclusivity and a high turnover rate, let's just say, and lower performance. So you're increasing your revenue, your expenses, but you're not producing any revenue. So you're losing money because you have to spend money to recruit, hire, train. And then those people that left, they're not making any money. So that spot is open. So showing that those connections helps leadership to see like, okay, this is actually a problem. How do we fix it? And I really don't think it's the employee's job to do this. I feel like leaders who want to remain competitive, who want to future-proof their company, have to prioritize DEI. So last year when George Floyd was murdered, I think everyone kind of became aware of DEI, not as in depth as like I am, for example, but it came on everyone's radar. At least anti-racism work did. And I feel like leaders should be actively trying to learn more about DEI, because the employee demographic is changing. The access to employees are more diverse. I believe it's like 80% of people applying to jobs prioritize DEI and want to make sure that the company that they work for is committed to DEI. So it's going to be harder to recruit and retain people if you're not actually committed in an effective and intentional way, not just saying that you're committed. So I think it really falls back on the leadership. So it should be their responsibilities. But if leaders aren't doing anything and employees want them to, I would say go with the data first, and show the connection between the data and the bottom line.
Well, we have a question from the audience. So are there certain industries that are more advanced with DEI than other industries?
No. That is the easy question. No, I don't think there are any. I would say probably startups. It'll be easier to interweave DEI into your operations if you're a startup, because you're building it from scratch. However, the people building a company have to be open-minded as well. So if they're not, it still won't be there won't be that level of commitment. But I have not seen any company, even the companies that are on best places to work and they get all those awards and stuff, they might be doing great things, but there's still gaps to be filled. I've seen they may be a little bit more advanced than other companies, but there's still gaps. And that's the thing I want to note, that DEI is a journey. You'll never, there's no endpoint. So you'll never be perfect or great at it, because the space is always changing. What it means to be equitable and inclusive is always changing, because it's centered around those who are most marginalized. And that changes depending on the climate of society. So no one will ever get it completely right or be perfect in this space, but it's important to make sure that companies have that commitment and they're dedicated to that, dedicated to learning and unlearning and changing systems and implementing new policies and processes and having a strategy, like I mentioned.
So I think we've all seen companies coming out with statements about diversity and saying their support for BLM, the Me Too movement, Stop Asian Hate, etc. What's your opinion on the effectiveness of these statements in influencing a company's culture?
So those statements are, companies put them out for their constituents, their external constituents. I don't think companies do that. Let me backtrack. I think some companies do put those statements out to show their commitment to DEI to their employees, but employees already know if you're committed or not. They work for the company. So if you don't have any policies or processes, if your employees aren't diverse, if you have a high turnover rate and people keep leaving, and then you put out this statement, the employees already know that you're not committed to DEI, and that's just performative DEI. Externally, I think last year, especially, a lot of consumers and people in society were looking to companies to put out those statements to show that they were bold enough to say those things. Because to be honest, I think people were grasping for straws, and it created some semblance of relief, like, whew, okay, they could at least say it, so they can't be that bad. But it goes way deeper than just a statement, because anyone can say a statement.
So, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Jess.
Well, that's what I was going to follow up with. So what are some hallmarks of a company that is effectively addressing biases? If, the statement, who knows sometimes whether that's actually reflective of their policies?
Right.
What could we be looking for?
Yeah. Like I mentioned, having a low turnover rate is my go-to. Granted, people can be leaving a company for other reasons other than DEI related reasons, but typically it's something related to DEI or even like harassment. It's not really DEI, but it fits into the sense of belonging, which people have started to add into the acronym of DEI. So turnover rate, the representation of different demographics across leadership roles and positions across different departments. So if you have a certain group of people predominantly at entry-level positions, and then you have a certain group of people and gender predominantly at leadership positions, that instantly tells me that there's something going on related to DEI, that there's probably no strategy or commitment to DEI. They might be in the beginning stages, but they're not practicing being effective and inclusive. So representation of different demographic groups, turnover rate, promotion rate. So internally, if you have access to this data, you can see who's been promoted and who's not. Termination data, exit interviews. If you look at why people were terminated or why people left, you can get some insight into what's going on. More overt indications of commitment to DEI are just policies. So policies to report microaggressions is a big one, because not a lot of companies have that. If they do, that tells me that they've done their homework, they're aware of unconscious biases and microaggressions, and they actually care if someone commits a microaggression at work. and they want people to be able to share that so that they can do something about it. I think those are some good indicators.
Okay. So this may not be in your wheelhouse at all, but I personally, as a consumer, is there a way that I can know which businesses are actually making efforts to address these concerns so I can support them?
So people are getting really not bold. I don't want to use the word bold, but very intentional about where they spend their money, and people are asking the tough questions. So there's really no surefire way to know beyond seeing the diversity that's being represented in leadership and the things that they do within their company. So if a company consistently supports like LGBTQ plus movements, or partners with societies that, or organizations that provide accommodations to those with disabilities or something along those lines, they consistently do that. That's one way to tell. Again, that's something very external facing. You don't know how they're actually treating their employees internally. Also, if they have like ERGs, dedicated space for DEI supporting groups, dedicated to stop marginalization of groups. So partnering with groups dedicated to that work. Like I
So I have
said,
to ask, ERGs?
oh,
I'm not familiar.
employee
Oh,
resource groups, or like infinity groups.
good. Yep.
Mhm. Yeah, so it's really hard to tell from the outside looking in, because it's easy to do external facing stuff. Because it's kind of, I've been seeing a lot of companies treat this work like charity, or like something to volunteer and do time with, I don't know, to put in community hours, I don't know. But that's not what DEI is. It's systemic change, it's policy development and implementation. So it's kind of hard for consumers to know. But if you really care, you can ask questions. And again, even if you ask questions, companies probably have like PR statements ready and prepped to just say the right things. So it's really hard to know. But I believe if they have statements to say the right things, at least they're aware about DEI topics enough to have that statement. I do also want to add, if a company says we don't do anything and we're actually trying, you can ask the follow-up question to say, like, what are you doing to try to commit to DEI? And that'll also tell you if they're really serious or they're just being performative.
Okay. We have another audience question. Let's see. I wonder what your thoughts are on this AAPI issue, which is something very important to the audience member as an Asian American. What have you seen or heard your peers do in this particular movement?
Sure. I have seen a lot of people be advocates speaking out against the hate that the AAPI community has faced, because I've been hearing that that's one of the issues, that it's been kept quiet. And one of my colleagues told me that in the Asian community, you don't really speak out or share a lot of negative things to bring negative attention to you. So a lot of times people in the Asian community kind of suffered in silence. And so a lot of people have been advocating and speaking out and bringing light to what's actually happening. And there are a lot of groups. I don't remember the name, but there are groups that are dedicated to ensuring the safety of elderly people in the Asian community. And you can donate to those groups. That's all I know of so far.
Well, if anybody knows anything else, go ahead and put it in the chat. This is an active room, so we'd love to learn more about it. All right, you know what? We've been talking about mentioning microaggressions a lot, so let's talk about them for a little bit. So can you define that term for us? What does a microaggression look like?
Sure, there's subtle acts that are committed against typically a marginalized group in an effort to discriminate against that group. So telling a joke. There are three types of microaggressions. One of them is very overt. So like if you spray paint a swastika somewhere, that's considered a microaggression because it's on an interpersonal level. but it's very overt. Like, that's very discriminatory. And then there's subtle things, like if you make a joke about like crossing the border, some people might say that's funny, but it's not. It's a microaggression. And then the third one is invalidating the experiences of marginalized groups. So probably like gaslighting. So if someone from a marginalized group says, oh, I feel like this was like a microaggression, I feel uncomfortable about it, and the person they're talking to says, I don't think that's what happened, that is a type of microaggression. It's invalidating the experiences of the marginalized group.
So how can you know, so besides the overt ones, which I'm sure you know, how can you know if you're making a microaggression against someone else?
Typically by body language and the way in which somebody responds. Some people might just tell you, like, that made me uncomfortable. That was a microaggression. Please don't do that again. Typically, though, a lot of people aren't comfortable saying that because normally the person who commits the microaggression responds in a very, they become the victim, or they then feel uncomfortable and turn it around to make it seem like you hurt their feelings. So a lot of people don't really say like that was a microaggression, but typically from body language and the way someone responds when you say something, if it's kind of like some sort of hesitance or like a face like that, 9 times out of 10, you said something that made the other person uncomfortable. Also, I always say, if you have to stop and think, should I say that? Or if you have to make the caveat that I'm not sure if I should say this, or this might sound weird, or I hope you don't get offended, just don't say it. Yep. It's probably something you shouldn't say.
So let's say that I have done something that offended someone and they hopefully felt comfortable enough to call me out on it and to say, hey, that made me feel uncomfortable, or like that wasn't funny or whatever. I think having some language prepared in situations helps me cope with the situation. So could you suggest some responses to being told that you just treated someone unfairly because of a bias, or that you did something wrong? How do you take that? How would you like that person to respond?
First, to apologize, because it's like in any relationship you have in life, like any personal relationship, if someone hit you or hurt your feelings and you told them, you would want them to say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Or even if they did, still acknowledge that they did it and don't do it again. Same thing with microaggressions. Just apologize and acknowledge, or try to understand what the microaggression was so that you don't repeat it.
So I think some of us, I'm not sure, some of us on the call today, maybe self-identified patent law science nerds like myself. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to know a little bit about your research. I was looking up on your resume, so this is totally out of left field, but what was your PhD thesis on and what were its findings?
Sure. So I did my dissertation on experiencing racial microaggressions in the workplace affects Black women's work performance. So I looked at the connection between unconscious biases, microaggressions, post-traumatic slave syndrome, and how that impacts the way in which Black women show up in the workplace and how people treat Black women in the workplace. And then how all of those incidents affect the way in which Black women perform at work. And then I provided some suggestions for ways in which companies could create inclusive and more equitable work environments for Black women. I use the frameworks of intersectionality, critical race theory, and Black feminist theory to ground my study.
Okay. And what were some of your suggestions?
A great question. So I'll share my findings first and then the suggestions.
Okay.
Because you did ask me that and I forgot to say it. So I found that regardless of level of education, age, socioeconomic status, level of job, type of job, Black women are likely to experience some form of racial microaggressions in the workplace. The participants in my study shared that they were often put in a box and viewed as being one-dimensional or aggressive or incompetent. These women and some of them were lawyers, some of them had high socioeconomic status, some of them had PhDs. So it didn't matter, and none of that mattered. They all shared similar experiences. They also expressed frustrations with constantly having to denounce their true selves by presenting like a conformed and polished version of themselves to fight against those stereotypes and avoid the possibility of experiencing racial microaggressions. So despite the gender and racial composition of their work environment, so even if the work environment was diverse and friendly, it didn't matter. They still felt excluded and they experienced racial microaggressions. And that's why it's important to couple inclusion and equity with being diverse, because it doesn't matter if there's just diversity. If there aren't policies and a strategy in place to ensure that there are equitable practices and that people are actually intentionally being included, then there's still going to be microaggressions in a toxic workplace. So the results of all of those experiences were the participants being doubtful of their abilities. They felt discouraged about going to work. They felt dejected. They just didn't even want to go to work anymore. A lot of them kept saying, I'm on the verge of quitting. A lot of them kept saying that. But I will say, despite those negative emotions, most of the women felt motivated by those experiences because they felt like I had to prove myself. So they worked harder. And that's just in the short term. If I did a longitudinal study, I would probably bet 100% that we would see high turnover rates, lower self-esteem, just negative mental health outcomes of those participants because they already started to feel it. They kind of just push those to the side for job security. But if you can imagine feeling like that over and over and over again, that's not good for your mental health. It'll probably show up outside of work in your personal life as well. And the next question about what I recommended, recommended that similar to what I said today, educating employees and especially leadership about topics like microaggressions, unconscious bias, intersectionality, and how to be inclusive and equitable in the workplace, sponsoring Black women, which is different than mentorship. So sponsorship is more active and involved, meaning you recommend the people that you sponsor to get promoted for different professional development opportunities, to be placed into conversations and rooms where they normally wouldn't have access to. That's what sponsorship looks like. Coupled, and there is a mentorship component. You still provide advice and training, that kind of thing, but the support and the being more active and intentional is what makes sponsorship different than mentorship. And then the last is to hold employees accountable. And you can do that by developing and implementing policies, or in my study, I recommended a DEI specific task force with decision-making abilities. So someone or a few people a part of the task force should have the ability to make decisions across the company to then enforce any type of disciplinary action or to address microaggressions and inequities when they arise.
Okay. Well, so, I know it's sometimes easy to become upset when you look at all the difficulties in addressing biases and the discrimination that's happening. But maybe as we get to closer to the end of the hour, what are some of the things that you see that give you hope? What are some good places, some good movements? Yeah.
I will say that the fact that everyone's talking, well, mostly everyone is talking about DEI gives me hope. Again, as I mentioned earlier, DEI is one, it has so many layers and components and sectors. It looks different across different industries. And it is a journey. It is heavily tied to our system across the country, like our policies and systems in place. And to really, really eradicate inequities and discrimination, there has to be change at a systemic level. So until then, taking the little steps to learn and unlearn and reframe and hire consultants and work with strategists like myself to develop strategies, that's what gives me hope. I looked at some data recently, and I think the amount of DEI positions from last year, this time to this year, rose by like 70 or 80%. I can't remember the number, but it was a lot. There are
Yeah.
a ton of jobs in this field, and they're getting filled. So I think that's a step in the right direction. It gives me hope. We just have to kind of continue to move forward, not just take one step, but continue taking those steps.
Okay. Well, so if our attendees wanted to learn more, what are some of the resources you'd advise? I know you mentioned a couple, but let's recap it and make sure that people get a takeaway of where they can go to learn more.
Sure. There are a lot. There are a lot of different places to go. One of my favorite books is Subtle Acts of Exclusion. And as I mentioned, if you go on Google and type in anything you're thinking related to DEI, I've recently done it just to see what was out there. There are a ton of articles, books, lists of suggestions, and I actually have a list. Let me pull it up really quickly. I can put
Oh,
it in.
yeah. And while you're doing that, there maybe if I talk about it, it will refresh your memory of what I'm actually talking about. There's like the implicit biases test that you can do yourself, which your little experiment during this reminded me of, where, you know, even though I'm assuming lots of the people who've been on this call have been working to address our own implicit biases, when you give us that scenario, it's still there. And that little test where you like push the button to see like which word like matches with your implicit bias, you know, faster. I always like to take that and see if I've addressed a little bit of my biases, but it just goes to show like how difficult and how ingrained these thoughts are. So I see you posted the document in there, so everyone can take a look at the list of where they could find more information. And please, guys, we got 5 minutes left, so put in your last question so I can get them before this ends. But if our attendees wanted to learn more about your work in particular, and I know you have a busy schedule, but you know, if they're looking to hire you in particular, how can they do that? How can they find out more about you?
Sure. I'll drop my website in the chat also. I'm very active on LinkedIn, so connect with me on LinkedIn. Let me drop that link also. That's my website. You can send me a message on LinkedIn or send me an email. I'm pretty responsive. Yeah, those are the two main ways.
And, you know, is there anything else, since we do have just a couple minutes left, that you wish I would have asked you, or you wanted to make sure that we covered?
Oh yeah, DEI strategy development, because I
Okay.
think that's the next step that needs to happen after we are all aware of different components of DEI. Having a strategy that is interwoven into the actual company or business, that is how you affect true meaningful change across the company.
And what does a DEI strategy look like? What are some components that you often recommend?
Sure. It's very similar to a business plan. Like when you have a business, you have a business plan. It's the same concept. It's just focused specifically on DEI. So you have a vision, some goals, objectives, some metrics and benchmarks. You have an implementation plan that shows you how to implement that actual strategy. And then you tie it to the different departments. So you should have goals and objectives related to hiring and recruiting, finance, so budget and supplier diversity if you have suppliers that you work with. What else? Policy development and implementation, promotion, mitigating high turnover rates. So a lot of it is HR, but DEI touches across different departments across a company, all the departments, not just HR, all of them.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, then I think that will close the hour out. Thanks so much, Dr. Sam, for an informative discussion. Thanks for answering all of my odd questions as they came to me. Really appreciate it, and the resources that you've provided to us.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed sharing with you all today.
Well, thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.